to make sure you're in the right place, we'll be talking here about taking back the Z word, grassroots ways to engage your community in the Zionism conversation. My name is Dylan Tatz. I'm the Director of Grant Making for the Becker Charitable Trust. And I'm delighted to introduce our panelists here. First, right next to me is Danny Grossman, who I'm sure you all know, the CEO of the Federation here, who's been very involved in this in a number of capacities for many years. In fact, creating the guidelines that he's had as a lay leader many years ago in terms of what to talk about vis-a-vis Israel. Next, David Halpern is the Executive Director of the Israel Policy Forum, previously a columnist for Haaretz and a number of other publications. Santi Antinas has been a lay leader at the UJ Federation in New York for many years, has worked closely with the Reut group and Gidi Greenstein, who, as you know, are putting together this conference, real thought leaders in the Jewish community. And Gina Rosenfield, originally a litigation attorney and now a successful business owner. Gina is a longtime member of the AIPAC National Council. And to kind of kick us off here, I wanted to share a reflection. I had an interesting call a couple weeks ago. This is with Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who you might know is the head of the Union of Reform Judaism, the umbrella organization for Reform congregations. This is right after the high holidays. And I asked him, just out of curiosity, what would you say, ballpark amount, Reform rabbis mentioning Israel in their Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur sermons? And he's like, funny you should mention that. I did an informal survey of Reform rabbis in the US. And he was shocked and I was shocked to learn that only 11% even mentioned Israel in their Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur sermons. So this is their biggest pulpit of the year, biggest audience, yet they don't mention Israel. So why is that? They're going to annoy somebody no matter what, right? No matter what you say, someone on the left or someone on the right is going to raise an issue with that. So that's, to me, why we're here today, is how can we have these conversations, not avoid the topic of Israel, but engage in dialogue from the left, from the right, everywhere in between, and try to understand what is the role of Zionism in this, and how can we actually talk about these things. So with that, turn it over to
Great. Thank you, Dylan. It's a pleasure to work with Dylan in working to build our community here. He's at the Becker Foundation and a wonderful professional to work with. Great to see you all. Thank you for joining. You should be shepping a lot of nachas, whether you know it or not. Because not only are we obviously here at the Oshman Family JCC standing at the front end of this Z3 revolution, which will define over the course of this day and beyond, but we were actually there at the beginning. When Gidi Greenstein stood up there and he said, you know, my mentors in this work, in thinking about peoplehood and its implication for this relationship, are Shulamith Bahat and Avraham Infeld. Avraham Infeld was the first chair of the Federation's Amutah in Israel, thinking about exactly this issue. Shulamith Bahat was the founding director of the Israel Center at the Federation, thinking about exactly these issues, and obviously neither of them have stopped. And Linda Brownstein, who's right here in the second row, was working centrally with them on this 20 years ago. So we should shep nachas for that. What should we be concerned about? Why are we here today? Because in the community portrait we just conducted as a federation, we learned that the vast majority of people in our community, of Jews in our community, and increasingly so the younger they get, don't just care that much about this. They don't care that much about this relationship. It's not that they're hostile toward Israel. Some are, obviously, but imagine a very thick bell curve. And at the front end, passionate Israel activists, at the back end, hostile toward Israel, and in the middle, this vast group that's just kind of ambivalent. And they're ambivalent because whatever nachas we're shepping today, we know that this conversation has gone very quiet in the last decades, and that's a consequence of that conversation going quiet. So much so that we at the Federation are actively contemplating and moving in the direction of investing more in the relationship than we invest in, as we have done in a path-breaking way, in creating a shared and pluralistic state in Israel over the past 30 years. That's critically important. But if this relationship goes away, then we've really lost the most important thing. So I'm going to keep my remarks very limited to that, because I really want you to hear from our panelists. And then we'll get into some questions, and as David Brooks said, we'll spend most of the time hearing ourselves talk to ourselves. So I think I'm going to take David first in the Israel Policy Forum. He's been introduced already. They'll give a few remarks each serially, and then we'll open it up to some questions from me and then from you. So please.
Sure, thank you. So I should stand, you think?
I think if you're
For
comfortable.
opening remarks,
If
sure.
you're comfortable. Yeah, opening remarks.
You can all hear me with this mic. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for choosing the very best breakout session that you had to choose from. This conversation is about taking back the word Zionism. And I know that this conference is very much about the divide, broadly speaking, between Israel and American Jews. But I think in this context, we're really talking about the divides amongst us and the American Jewish community and how we relate to this concept of Zionism, right? How do we come to terms with the idea of Jewish nationalism, of Jewish statehood, and our support for a Jewish homeland? And I would argue to have a more impactful and a more engaged conversation around Israel and around Zionism, we should think of three let's call them tenets, or three goals. Number one, I would argue that we need to be working in partnership. There is a different organization for every stream of thought, for every stream of every neighborhood and suburb in the Jewish community. Today, if we're only speaking to those that confirm our beliefs, we're not creating an impactful conversation around Israel and around Zionism. And we have to be very honest with ourselves and with each other that there are three growing gaps in the American Jewish community when it comes to engaging with the state of Israel. Number one is the generational gap between young and old, which I would argue is getting worse. There is a political gap between Democrats and Republicans in our community and beyond, which I would argue is getting worse. And I would argue there is what I would call a denominational gap between observant and secular around the question of Israel and Zionism, and that too is getting worse. And I believe that too many of the efforts around engaging with the question of Zionism and around engaging with Israel and the Jewish community is serving to fuel one side of those divides. And it's wonderful to have a perspective, and my organization has a perspective. We're an organization that's committed to supporting the goal of a two-state solution that provides for Israel's security. Having said that, if we're only speaking to those who are already convinced, then we're not actually creating a dynamic and engaged community, and we're not moving the needle. So the first core principle, I would argue, is to create partnerships across those divides of the American Jewish community. The second, I would argue, thing that we need to do is insert substance into our conversations around Israel and not shy away from really understanding the elements on the ground. And here I want to speak specifically to younger engagement and why it is difficult, I believe, in part, to engage with the next generation, is that our Israel advocacy should not be able to fit in a tweet. It's not just slogans. It needs to be about substance. This is a recipe for disengagement is being told what tweet to retweet, what bumper sticker to have, and to merely cheerlead. It is not enough to cheerlead alone. We have to teach, educate, grapple with the complexities that Israel is facing today. And yes, I'm referring to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Rather than only focusing on issues that go beyond the conflict, we should grapple with those complexities in the realm of education, learning about those complexities. Once you have a more rounded understanding of those complexities, you can understand not only how to be a more effective advocate for Israel as a secure Jewish and democratic homeland, but I believe more prepared to provide leadership to the broader Jewish community and beyond. Lastly, I'll say is to be very forthright, and to be honest in our analysis, and that is, let's not sugarcoat the challenges that we face. I think a lot of times in the view of civility, we want to only focus on those issues that are clearly issues of consensus. We don't want to have those food fights. And I'm sorry Melissa Weintraub caught the flu, because she would be phenomenal in discussing how you can engage with these difficult issues without devolving into a food fight. It's what they do at Resetting the Table. But I think we need to be very honest about the substantial challenges issues that are impacting American Jewish engagement with Israel. And again, I refer to the growing divides that were talked about earlier today, whether it's the increasing perception of Israel moving rightward with an American Jewish community moving leftward, and the uncertain future about Israel and its relations with the Palestinians and how that impacts the future of Israel as a Jewish, democratic, and secure state. And the last thing I will say is I think we need to start talking about these issues again by asking our communities how they want to engage. We've had at our organization great success in engaging young professionals that are after college, not by necessarily preaching to them on how they should think, but asking them how they choose to engage and giving them the tools to create their own engagement with Israel. And I think it is especially critical to impart when we're engaging with Israel in all its frustrations and grappling with all of these complexities, to remember what was said earlier today, which is the enormous significance of this moment of Israel that as a power and as a Jewish community in such a strong place. I believe that the next 5, 10 years, 15 years will not only be significant for the future of the state of Israel, it'll be significant for the future of the American Jewish community. In the future, it'll be significant in the way that we look at the history of the Jewish people. And if you can't get excited about being a part of that conversation that is so impactful in the thousands of years story of the Jewish people, then we should talk about what you get excited about, because I think that is an incredibly exciting conversation. And yes, it will be frustrating, but I'm suggesting that we not shy away from those complexities and we engage more deeply. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. So I'm going to ask Gina Rosenfield to go next. She's a local pro-Israel advocate here and has done a lot of grassroots organizing and networking, and I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, great. Are you okay if I stay seated? Okay, sure. I've got to be honest with you guys. This morning is my first exposure to this new 21st century Zionism. I've kind of been steeped in the old Herzl view of creating a secure nation state, and I found it really illuminating and exciting. But there were a couple of points that really struck me this morning, and two touchstones, and that was a sense of Jewish unity and a sense of community. Because in my career as a pro-Israel advocate these past 15 years or so, I've been steeped in what we call pro-Israel politics. So we've developed a loose network of about 60 to 70 families who are engaged in meeting with our policymakers. We bring senators and congressional leaders to the Bay Area, and we have conversations with them in living rooms from Los Gatos to San Mateo. And we take this opportunity to educate these policymakers about the issues facing Israel, maybe pending legislation, thank them for their support of Israel. And it's been a fabulous way to enter dialogue with our policymakers, but also with each other. Because the best part of this is that we are a bipartisan group. People in the room range from far right to far left and everything in between. We have men and women. We have people upwards of 80 years old and teenagers come. We have professionals working, we have moms. So it's just really been such an empowering experience to bring this group together and create a sense of community with a group that is all united about one thing, and that is their passion for a secure Jewish homeland. So I invite you all to join in this kind of work with us know that it exists. It exists not only here in the peninsula in Silicon Valley, but there are groups like this in the East Bay, San Francisco, and Marin. And it's very encouraging to me. And I feel like this is the kind of group that we need to nurture and protect, and this is going to take us through in the future.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gina. Appreciate it. And last but hardly least is Sandy Antignas, who comes to us from the Federation in New York. As a lay leader, he oversees much of the work around Israel.
So I'm going to come at this from a little bit of a different angle. And I think building from the conversation this morning and this notion about the Z3 movement, I always am very circumspect about using old words and old models that met a very important, successful need to try to meet future needs. So that's just sort of, I tend to be a bit skeptical with terminology, not necessarily with the substance. And it goes back to, how do we bring the Z word back into the conversation? And part of this is, I think we all are faced with, and you mentioned this, the Z word is complicated. You bring people around it, they bring their own biases, definitions, history, baggage, may or may not be accurate, but it is kind of what it is to the conversation. So I want to suggest that, we really need to think about asking a couple questions. First, what's the end game? What are we actually trying to accomplish? And where and who is our audience? And I'm thinking about the where because part of the spirit of this conference is it's not just about us here, it's also there. If we talk about with Israelis, with American Jews, with Jews in other parts of the world, it's different. And it's different across different segments within all those different communities. And also the answers are different about who's there. The people here in this room and at this conference are a very different kind of group of people with a different understanding and sense about it than the vast majority of Jews who are not here today, of all age groups. And also, you'd like to point out and remind ourselves that they talk about, which is I think very true, that Israel being the project of the Jewish people. Well, it became just that because there was a broad consensus of Jews everywhere across all spectrums of the need. And in my view, for most American Jews, it wasn't driven by an ideological agenda. It was driven by a need and a sense of collective responsibility for the Jewish people and a sense of support for Israel. For most American Jews, isn't about them needing a refuge, but it's there because we have a sense of responsibility in caring for Jews everywhere, and not just because we may feel that Jews from the Soviet Union need a refuge, or Argentina, or France, but not because that we feel it, but it's because we feel responsibility to all Jews everywhere. And I think that's really important because, now, thank goodness, for the most part, and not in all ways, Israel is a given to a great extent. And what drove, I think, that Zionism 2.0, and at least some people like to think it is, was the notion of this imperative, which was the need to build and create the state of Israel. The challenge right now is that we don't really have an ability to articulate what the imperative for the Jewish people is today as a people. And I think that's part of the challenge. And it's part of the challenge about our own communities here, and it's part of the challenge around Israel as well. And so I like to suggest that maybe we should start to engage also around this in a little different way. And about a different kind of question, for example, is what do we aspire for us as Jews and as a Jewish people in the 21st century? There could be other questions, but just using this as an example, and in the context, I think, of some of the things that were talked about this morning. Why does something like this make sense to think about? One, it's a question where we and Israelis are equals at the table. It's also a question where we as Jews here and Israelis have a collective interest in each other's evolution and success. And if we also do this conversation correctly, it may in itself help reshape a healthier understanding and sustainable relationship and conversation about Israel here and also about us there. And as part of it, I think it's also important to think that we think about this big geographical divide. The more time I spend in Israel and the more time I spend around the issue, it becomes clear to me that in many cases the divides aren't necessarily geographical. They're much more about right versus left, religious versus non-religious, and you can add many to the list. The point being is that there actually are Israeli Jews and American Jews of common interest around subject matters that they care about, that don't know that each other exists, that they could actually engage with each other and collectively as we talk about what this Jewish people going forward is, what this Israel going forward is, what our local Jewish community is going forward around issues of common cause. And perhaps build bridges and understanding, and also as a way for, goes back to, I think the main question for this panel is, how do you find a way for American Jews to engage with Israel in a way that they find comfortable? And I think a big part of it is that there are a lot of American Jews, and certainly a lot of people I know, who don't really fully understand, whatever you're, wherever you may be on the political spectrum and view about anything, that there are Israelis just like you who care about those same issues, that are working there on the same issues, just like you're working here, as we work collectively to debate as Jews everywhere about which way we should go. And I think reframing the conversation being first as the entry point about the Jewish people and its inherent main pillars, which are Israel, Zionism, world Jewry, makes it a conversation that's about all of us. It's not just about Israel. It really is about all of us. And so those who, maybe less comfortable or connecting with the conversation for Israel may be able to find that this is something they actually have a stake in because it's really about all of us. It's not just about them. And just to wrap up, and then we can go to conversation. Rightly and by necessity, after World War II, the focus of Jewish people really was on this project of building and securing the state. Thankfully, for the most part, we live in different times, and there, has been pointed out, there have been miracles there and miracles here. And so perhaps it's not so much about talking about taking back the Z world, it's about putting the focus back on the Jewish people as a whole with Israel and the Z world and the principles of the Z3 movement. And that's, because I think it articulates about a lot of the work that needs to be done, quite frankly, in Israel that are key drivers of this process. And through this, perhaps then everybody can have a basis to come around the table and talk about Zionism, talk about what we need to do in this community to create strong connected Jewish community. A lot of things that has nothing to do with Israel as well as what's there, and look at it more holistically. Because my big fear is that the people here today are the people who are going to come engage in this conversation about Israel, and they're going to come to engage around Zionism. But what we really need to be worried about, and I know that everybody in this room is also worried about, is all those who are not here. And the question is, how do we provide an entry point to the conversation about us as Jews and Jewish people, and how can they, through that lens, engage in the notion of Israel and Zionism and find a way to know that, it may not all be just as they think it is, and ride the volatility, because there's lots of volatility, but feel anchored in something that's all of us collectively. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. So before we go to some questions and then hear your comments, a reminder, this is intended to be generative of ideas for us to drive this movement. So in the spirit of Rabbi Melissa Weintraub, who unfortunately does have the flu today, she beseeched us to note that their work is about leaning into discomfort, having the difficult conversations, and I encourage us also to do that. But with the idea, with the driving notion of curiosity, not the driving notion to win the argument, but curiosity about how we can sharpen our game in moving forward and accelerating this Z3 movement. So with that, I'm going to start with the premise of this conversation, which is that we're trying to recover the Z word. And I'll ask the question you left unasked, but you danced around, which is, should we recover the Z word? In a very practical way, as you think about rolling out this movement, as we think about rolling out this movement, is that the right banner, or is that banner going to create problems for us? So I'm going to go to David first.
Sure. Can I stay seated? Is that all right? I can stand up. Okay. All right. Hi, guys. Yeah, we should not shy away from it. I think that absolutely we should. I mentioned to Danny, we spoke a couple days ago, that our organization has recently undergone an examination of our core values, and this actually came up in our conversation: is do we put the Z word in there, right? Is Zionism one of our core values? And it absolutely is. Because if what we are all about is the realization of a secure Jewish and democratic state, then we are about the realization of a Jewish homeland that provides for its citizens. We're about the realization of the goals of the dreams of the Zionist founders. And particularly for our work, we recognize there's three kind of core pillars of the early Zionist goal. It was a Jewish state, it was a democratic state, and it was in the Jewish homeland. It was in the land of Israel. And when Israel accepted the partition plan, it acknowledged that it was about a Jewish homeland, a democratic state in part of the land. And so the work that we're advocating for now, advancing the idea of a secure two-state solution, advancing that goal in pragmatic ways that acknowledge the genuine threats to Israel's security, is continuing in that Zionist tradition. And I think that Zionist tradition, the Zionist tradition of recognizing the imperative of a Jewish homeland that serves as a democratic state for all its citizens, is a constant struggle and a constant challenge. It's one that we're all obviously talking quite a lot about today. But to discard the notion of Zionism, to give up on the word as too politically toxic, or to suggest that it only reflects one side of the political spectrum, in many ways, is to give up on our support for that goal of a Jewish, democratic, secure homeland. And that's something that we refuse to do. And so I would argue that the word Zionism is not owned by one side of the political spectrum or the other, but we should all grapple with the way in which we relate to Zionism, but not give up on the Z word.
Great, thank you. Sandy, Gina, comment to that?
Look, I think, just to emphasize a little bit what I said before, is I don't think we should give up on it. I think it's about the entry point and how we contextualize it.
Yeah.
Because I think the reality is most American Jews don't really understand it and don't understand what it actually really means. And I think the question is more about so not letting language get in the way of what the goal is. And so it's about contextualization.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on something that you both discussed that really has to do with education, not just of American Jews. I would say the public square, and you talked a little bit about tweeting. I forget which one. Yeah. And I've been thinking a lot about this, shaping public opinion, shaping a pro-Israel narrative, because the public square is so closely aligned with the legislative body that you really, to have the for the legislative body to be responsive to the public square, we have to communicate a pro-Israel narrative and get the American people, not just Jews, on our side, and kind of understand what our cause is all about, and how do we do that. And I absolutely think that the complexities regarding Israel are just so great. It can't be done even in a 60-second soundbite, 90-second soundbite, let alone a tweet. But one thing I'm pretty excited about is this whole new social media world of podcasts and YouTube. And I think this is really going to work for us, that this can be a vehicle to help educate Americans on Zionism and all the good that Israel does, because it lends itself to long form. There are podcasts out there that go from 1 to 3 hours. How great is that forum to discuss the complexities of Israel? So I think that's something that we need to look at when we talk about more engagement.
Great, thank you. So one more question that I'm going to you, and I'll go to you old school, without texting anything. Yeah. And that question is, what is the best approach you've seen to engaging people in this conversation who otherwise would have been disinclined. There was not something ideally that was within your purview or your organization or your specific work. What's the best approach you've seen others take to drawing people into this conversation?
Do I have to go first again?
No, you don't. No, Gina's got it. She's jumping right
I'm just going to tell you, the best thing I've done in my work is in the pro-Israel politics world is just inviting people to come and engage in a vibrant discussion. Because a lot of the work that we do, they actually are fundraisers, and I invite people, don't give a dime. Don't write a check for anything, but just come and listen to the conversation and have that feeling about talking to someone who's going to make a difference and see how self-empowering that is. It's so hard for us as one person in today's world to make a difference.
Great.
And if people get a taste of it, they come back for more.
Excellent. Thank you. Sandy?
Yeah, I'll give a plug for our missing panelist, Melissa Weintraub, because I think what she's done actually is really among the best in terms of what is. And in just, 2 words, I think it's about creating safe space where people who have challenges about Israel feel they can come and speak safely with those who may think differently and allow that conversation to happen in a healthy way.
Thank you.
So I'll second the work that Resetting the Table does in terms of engaging with those who don't necessarily agree. I think that, frankly, you all should feel very privileged that you have a local JCC that puts on this sort of program you're going to be exposed to such diverse viewpoints and be able to really grapple with so many issues. I would argue groups like Encounter, if you're not familiar with an organization Encounter that takes American Jewish leaders to meet with Palestinians in the West Bank and understand their narrative, those things that challenge us, that don't simply reinforce our own talking points, our own perspectives. That's what's needed if we're going to be, I think, better understanding not only the challenges that Israel faces, but also begin to talk about the opportunities and elevate the level of the discourse when we talk about Israel in our community, away from what I think have become talking points that serve more as slogans, which are creating a feeling of I dare say, a shallower conversation that doesn't enable us to really engage with the real challenges that this moment requires us to engage with.
Great. So I'm going to go here. Before I do, I'll tell you that I warned them that I was going to ask them, that's the perfect segue, I was going to ask them, when was the last time you had to rewrite your own talking points?
Yeah.
Because I think if all of us recognize that imperative, and we don't all do it as much as we probably should. So I'm not going to ask that question, but you could, because I want to go out to you now. So please, right in the middle. Yes, you. Could you give us your name?
Certainly. Bruce Solivar.
Thank you.
I selected this breakout session because it talked about grassroots engagement.
Yes.
And I appreciate hearing about your organizations. But I'm not hearing too much actually about grassrootsness. So I would like to say here right now in the South Bay, Santa Clara area, there is a grassroots effort to push forth a Zionist effort in a very visible way. And I'd like to share it because it has truly come from the grassroots. And that is at the San Jose Women's March, which happens January 19th. There will be a Zionist presence there, carrying Zionist signs. Now, our goal is to have 200 Jewish people. And I mean people because the Women's March is about more than women. It's about all people who care about issues of justice and equity, and also Israel and Zionism. So we are looking for 200 people to commit themselves to come and hold with us signs that very clearly say we are Zionists, and you can add whatever it is that you feel passionate about, whether it's immigration or a women's right to choice or any other issue that is of value and concern to you. You can find us on Facebook at Bay Area Zionists. You know, as in wilderness, princess, they're Zionists.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And a great example of the kind of grassroots activity that we are contemplating and talking about. Yes, just behind her. Sue.
Hi, my name's Shulamith Bahat, and my question is part of Melissa's call to having a uncomfortable dialogue, which is really, I've done a lot of work with the United Nations, and I know that a lot has been done there to equate the word Zionism with racism, and that's something that's very prominent on social media. So I'm curious how, in your work, you address reframing that, and if anybody else has interesting responses.
Thank you.
Can I just, if someone wants a microphone, look at me and I'll bring it.
Great. Thank you. Someone want to tackle that?
Look, I think different organizations focus on different parts of this very complex effort that goes on. And certainly there are Jewish organizations that you know about, not the federations, that are front and center at addressing those kinds of issues. But I think part of that is also does get to the difficult conversations within our own community about particularism, universalism, and issues that among a lot of Jews who can't, and it goes to the notion of Zionism as well, hold both of them simultaneously. And I think so in some respects, not only do we need to have those conversations and the work done at the United Nations, other places to continue to deal with those kinds of issues, but we also need to have those kind of conversations in our own community so that the right distinctions are made about whether or not you have issues with Israeli policy in the West Bank, and whether you have issues with the, how they may treat, the Palestinians, or whether this or that, that the distinctions are better understood, so that we as a community and different voices of our community are not necessarily, might say, furthering some of that kind of activity that all of us would prefer not to see happen at the United Nations.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Others want to contribute? David?
Look, I think here is where I really have to stake a claim for the mission of our organization, which is preserving and advancing the goal of a two-state solution, working alongside it. The imperative of ensuring that we preserve the idea of a two-state solution, give voices and exposure to those Israelis who are fighting to advance that goal in a way that is consistent with Israel's security, I think is critical to being able to answer those who would argue that Zionism is racism. Because unless we ultimately see the long-term future for the state of Israel that serves as a Jewish state and a democratic state, and one that is secure, that is our ultimate defense. Zionism is the realization of Jewish nationalism, but it is in part of the state of Israel. I think that the notion that we could discard the goal of two states, effectively absorb the West Bank and 2.5 million Palestinians, facing a challenge in which 50% or more of effectively the state of Israel are Arab citizens that are not treated in the same way or that have second-class status, then we are going to continue to be challenged with those who make such claims. I think you may have seen Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times just a couple of days ago made this argument that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and there was a lot of in that piece that riled me a bit. But one thing that she wrote in that op-ed that is very, very challenging for us is that so long as there are Israelis, so long as there are Jewish advocates for Israel who say there can be no Palestinian state, that the answer is a one-state solution, how can we say that when the Palestinians call for a one-state solution, effectively the elimination of Israel, that it's off limits? It's imperative that we talk about the necessity for preserving two states. I would argue that it is imperative that we defend Israel and its security, and we recognize that it's not going to happen in the near term, frankly. I think the only person that believes in the ultimate deal today might be the President of the United States, but that does not mean nothing can be done. We should talk about the challenges and the steps that can be done in order to most effectively defend the idea of Zionism and Jewish nationalism.
Thank you, David. Gina, do you want to contribute to the Zionism, racism? No. Good. Okay, other questions. Here on the end.
Yossi Hollander. Studies have shown that most Americans don't care. So
Don't care about
Israel-Palestinian conflict, but they have opinions on it. And they know who's the good guys and who are the bad guys. And nobody actually wants to be explained. You're trying to explain to everybody like a few hours what is the Zionist way is coming from. They don't want to hear. So how do you get the majority of Americans to support Israel? Not because they know, just because we're the good guy, the bad guy, whatever. That I think is the question that I haven't heard anybody. How Zionism is good, because right now it's both very bad. How do you make it good? You're explaining. They don't hear. Right.
Yeah. I can't stand here and tell you exactly how we do that, but I share your concern, and I recently joined a board of an organization called the Israel Project. I don't know how many of you are familiar about it. Have you heard about it? It's really an organization focused on strategic communications. And I touched a little bit about social media earlier, but I feel like communications and media is everything right now. And I think that this is our next battle. I know this conference is about Z3, but I've been really thinking that in the pro-Israel movement, I look at it like a stool with 3 legs, and one leg is Tzedakah, and you have Federation and JNF and Hadassah Hospital, and we support Israel with our charity. And another leg is congressional support and public policy. But there's this third leg, and it's really wobbly, and it's communications and the pro-Israel narrative. And I feel like we need to build an infrastructure now, because this is the next battle. So we have, the community.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a contradiction in what you're saying, because you're saying that Zionism isn't polling well, but nobody cares. But if it's not polling well, then somebody's paying attention and thinking something about it, right? I actually want to challenge that a bit, because you're right. In the broader scheme of things, people are not, focusing in the way that many of us in this room probably do on the day-to-day of the politics and this or that or the other. There's all issues that you care about are local issues. But I would argue that when it comes to foreign policy issues in the United States, there might be few issues that resonate more than what's going on in Israel for Americans, Jewish or non, or across the board, Christian and otherwise, that Israel is everyone feels they have a stake in the Holy Land and in the future of the Holy Land. And I think that it's critically important to recognize the absolute challenges that we're facing right now. I don't think we should sugarcoat them. Where we have, by the way, I would argue on the far right, a growing extreme view, both in Israel and in the United States, that increasingly has a platform, just as the far left in the United States is also increasingly having a platform. And we may be in a situation, I would argue, that in the next presidential election, the state of Israel and the U.S. relationship with Israel may be a political football in ways that it never has been before. And that is deeply challenging. It's deeply worrisome for those of us who care deeply about the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship. But I think our challenge on apathy is 2 parts. There's a challenge, and I particularly want to focus on the American Jewish community, not necessarily the public at large. The issue of apathy is driving some to disengage from Jewish involvement in any realm so that they don't focus on Israel that much. But there's another challenge, which is those who do engage with the community, who are the product of strong Jewish education, and they are growing up and seeing that they're not identifying with the current direction of the state of Israel, and then they are growing apathetic and disengaged as a result. But it's not, I would argue that it's not a question of getting people to care. That is part of the question, but it's about caring how they can be part of the conversation and shaping the future.
Thank you, David. Sandy, do you want to jump in on that?
Just the only thing I would add, and just, I think to echo one of the things that you said, is I think this not caring, a lot of those people who are not caring are also not caring about being part of our own local Jewish community. So some of the this work issue is about we here in the United States and how we reshape what it means to be a Jew, means to be part of our community, because people who feel part of that part of a people are more apt to take the next leap to engage with the broader sense of the Jewish people. And so some of it's on us. That actually has nothing to do with Israel, although I think some would argue Israel actually makes that effort challenging too. So I think we also have to, put that out there as well.
Thank you. So for those of you who came in looking, as Ruth did, for specific marketing tools, or specific grassroots tools as a former marketer, obviously you have to think about what's your message, who's your audience, how best to reach them, and that's how I view this conversation, which I think is critically important before we reach that. So yes, here to the left.
I wasn't going to talk, but something David said made me have to stand up. I'm starting to think I'm at the wrong conference on St. J Street out there, and then something you just said really kind of struck me. I grew up in Palo Alto, but I lived in Israel for 10 years. And I disagree with the idea that it has to be a two-state solution. Read Carolyn Glick's book. You can see a path to a one-state solution. The thing that you said that made me kind of have to talk was that if Israel embraces the Palestinians, they are truly going to embrace them. If the one-state solution happens on the other side, there will be no Israel. So you said those are equivalent. They're totally not equivalent.
Can I add to that?
So you don't need to respond there. Well, let me, you had this one. Go ahead.
My heart rate was when you were speaking it. Back to Rick Jacobs, who was my roommate in Minnesota back in 1975. We did this poll. Part of the problem with the grassroots effort is the rabbis aren't teaching Zionism or the history of Zionism, the history of Israel from the pulpit. They're teaching Tikkun Olam to build houses in Guatemala. That's one of the first problems. Tikkun Olam is overtaken the liberal Judaism of America, and we got to get back to people who don't have to begin to teach the history. The history doesn't start in 1967. It starts maybe 1880, 1850, or even back further than that. So there needs to be an effort to teach in the synagogues what the history is. The second thing, regarding the two-state solution, I would ask you to consider, and Mike Harris and I stand with the other ongoing debate. For the last 15 years, people have been talking about a two-state solution. During that time, support for Israel or Zionism has gone down. Have you tested how that narrative resonates with the millennials or the college kids? What you're doing is you're watering down Zionism's message. You're watering down Jewish rights to land and our authenticity to be there, to the Temple Mount. There is no parallel to this, to allowing or accepting Jewish rights on the Palestinian side. So I don't advocate just a one-state solution. I advocate direct negotiations between the parties and let the Israelis and the Palestinians work it out.
So, thank you. And I think, again, in the vein of trying to harvest ideas that will lead to deepening these conversations, the notion of how the synagogues are or are not engaged around Israel, I think, is a critically important one. I'm not going to presume that we have a lot of hands, so you'll tell me if you want to jump in.
Let's take more,
Take a few more. Okay,
Yeah,
I've got you back in the far corner. Yes, yes, the one who's hand.
Thank you very much for your comments. So I'm sort of taking all of this in, I'm thinking of three different themes. One, I do think words matter. And when we talk about Zionism, even though I know what you're saying, it's become a target for anti-Semitism, and it's equivalent. And part of the bringing the second one back into the first of my thoughts here is that what we're talking about is actually peoplehood. And that if you're anti-peoplehood, you've outed that you're anti-Semitic, and that peoplehood has, what's our relationship with Israel? Who are we? But I think the idea of peoplehood, and it actually lends legitimacy to people can have a nation. And when you talk about then the resolution, when you talk two states, I had my brain turned around on that at one point a number of years ago. Because when I think of a state, I think of the difference between Montana and South Carolina. That's absolutely not what's at stake there in the Middle East. And we come from a very American perspective. And I agree that this is something where there is a country, we do have a people, they figure out what works. From the Arab side of the equation, I was recently in Israel, and an Arab Israeli woman said that she was for a one-state solution, but it was a different angle. When you think of a one-state from the radical Palestinian side, it is a Jew-free place.
Right.
When you think of a one state from the Israel side, so I think that when we're doing a narrative about Israel, and then what are the action items? My first things were peoplehood and states were words matter. And then the last thing is, when we're talking about action items, I absolutely agree. What we want to do is power multipliers. So when we go out there and vote, when we speak with our political representatives, they have a vote, they make a difference in how we deal with an Israeli democracy, which is vibrant and they actually talk to each other. I think that's very important. And the last one is that what we can do in addition to Zionists is when someone comes and they're very prescriptive about Israel, have you ever asked them, when were you last in Israel? Because I do that all the time. I have yet to find someone who's incredibly prescriptive.
I do want to get some other people in. So.
Prescriptive. They've not been to Israel. So I think what we can do is take a friend to Israel, Jewish or non-Jewish. So that's a grassroots.
Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do 3 more brief, please, because then we can get them to comment. So I've got one here. I've got one here. Oh, I know. There's many people have had their hands up for a long time. So with apologies, and you there. So 1, 2, 3. All right, and we'll go 4. Fine. 1, 2, 3, 4. Brief, please.
Michael Sosby. I was walking down the street. Nice lady with Amnesty International vest. I said, "I'm sorry, I can't support you because you support BDS and you're anti-Israel." And they said, "Oh no, we're not anti-Israel. We're anti-Zionism." Last week, the UN passed, I think, 11 resolutions against Israel. Someone said, "Israel is a given." I challenge that. Is Israel a given? Where my daughter and my grandchildren live.
Okay. Thank you. Neil.
Neil Brownstein. There are more than one. There's more than one elephant in the room, and it's not. There's more than one elephant in the room. There's more than one elephant in the room, and it's not just the Z word. And I think if there's a takeaway from this conclave, is who and how are the facilitators and organizers over the next year, 2 or 3, probably at the JCCs, to carry this conversation in a robust way. 1 state, 2 state, I don't think is the only elephant in the room. Young, old is not the only elephant in the room. How do we, as a community or set of communities, bring our conversation forward in an organized, civil way, and how do we measure that over this course of the next year or 2 or 3? And we'll find out. Anybody comes? Nobody comes?
Right.
Somebody comes.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Yes, please.
So I actually have a question for, yes, I definitely can.
And I'll let you guys respond after these 2.
That's fine.
Yeah, so I have a question. I hope it's okay. I'm going to kind of steer the conversation away from what we've been talking. So I work for Stand With Us, and my experience with Stand With Us, and also, thank you. And my experience also in college is that a lot of times minority groups don't tend to side with Zionism and those types of causes. And so I was wondering what you all have done to engage those groups that actually have very similar values to what Zionism holds, but perhaps have lost the meaning of Zionism. For instance, Black Lives Matter nationally endorses BDS, So I was wondering if all your organizations or you individually have any insight on how to re-engage those communities.
Great, thank you. And then final question before we go back to the panel for general responses.
Thank you for taking my question.
Yeah.
My name is Carolyn. I'm a Jewish community leader in Phoenix, Arizona. And what I'm finding in my community, thank you, and what I'm finding in my community is a divide along many levels. And I'm going to get very logistic, and my question is very specific, and I really want to hear tachlis, how we engage grassroots in our community, because what I'm finding is we're having a generational issue, a generational divide between Zionism 2.0 and Zionism 3.0. What I'm finding is we have, for example, the synagogues are not where Jewish action is happening. It's happening more and more at the JCC level and not even there. It's not in a brick and mortar and it's not in the old institutions, and our federations need new models. But they're the ones with the money, and the money comes from the old generation who's still seeing things in a Zionism 2.0 way. And how do we get our federation to understand that even though they're held captive by the money of the older generation and the Zionism 2.0, that we have a younger generation that needs to meet outside of the synagogues, need to meet outside of the old institutions in creative, new, innovative ways, and get them to fund our efforts to do that, because the product that will arise isn't what they've been looking at for the last 50 years.
Great, thank you. And I may jump in on that one, but I'm going to go to you guys for answers, impressionistic thoughts.
Look, I'll address the last two items. In terms of your point, which is really spot on, I think there's a couple different levels with that. One is also about how we as a community begin to re-engage with other minority communities. That's something that we as a Jewish community did a lot, but we haven't been doing as much. So that we want them to care and think hard about our issues. We have to think hard and care about their issues, and that's something that I think more attention is being given to in the local community relations council, issues of understanding about coalition building and us working more closely with them. That's in the broad sense. I think on the college campus, one interesting thing that we've done in New York is we've actually taken leaders from these different minority groups on campus to Israel on a trip. And it's about influencing the influencers and helping them understand and see the complexity. And also, by the way, one thing we also actually just had a recent conversation with the Jewish Agency about is sending a shluchim that's Ethiopian. Think about that. Think about having on campus an Ethiopian Israeli. What does that do to sort of jar the conversation and the stereotypes? So these are the things that we need to do better and think about what we can do to better engage that. And the other piece I just wanted to respond to you in terms of the federations, this is part of the generational change that's going on. And I think one of the important things in the role of a federation is what I call intermediation. We live in a world of disintermediation, and one of these things about intermediation is being able to look and be able to articulate and understand exactly what you're saying and funding that and articulating to our donors, many of them who are older, that if what you really want to happen is this, you need to trust us to be able to intermediate and provide funding to kinds of organizations that you're talking about to be able to do those things to do. It's not easy, but it is actually a role that federations as intermediaries can actually perform well if they can navigate it. So.
Maybe I'll just pick up that for a moment and go back to you guys if you want to take it. I couldn't agree more with your first comment. After Pittsburgh, I sat on the Bema at Temple Congregation Emmanuel in San Francisco, flanked by clergy of color and of other faiths, and thinking to myself, how often have I been at their places of worship and stood with them? So I think that's very much on our minds. Second one is really important. I agree with you. It's not just a generational change. This is the the most challenging generational change in the history of Jewish people. Think about the greatest tragedy, the greatest triumph in antiquity was entering the land of Israel. And the greatest tragedy was the destruction of the Second Temple. That was separated by hundreds and hundreds of years and many generations. The greatest tragedy in modernity is the Shoah, of course, and the greatest triumph is the creation of the State of Israel. 5 years, less, 5. And it's that generation, that extraordinary generation, that is part of that, what you call generational shift. Really complicated. I'm excited to say someone who works with us, Gil Troy, is sitting right there. She, with her colleagues, is the author of the solution to your question, which is If we produce it and say how it has to be, and specifically around Israel and specifically around Yom Ha'atzmaut, they may come, they may not come. But if we fund them to do it the way they think it should be, then it's different. With guidelines, as Dylan said at the beginning, not just anything goes. But that is, I think, an approach that we're starting to look at taking. Now back to you guys, or we can go back to questions.
So there's a number of questions about the one state, two state, and I'll kind of our perspective. So I'll just mention that. I think that there was a couple of questions that said the Palestinian vision of a one state is free of Jews. It's just different than the other. Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that at all. I think one state solution, period, is an existential threat to the state of Israel as a Jewish homeland. End of story. I would argue that Israel is a vibrant country. It is a strong country. Thank goodness it has a phenomenal military. Israel is not going away. There is only one threat, and that is a demographic threat that challenges the notion that Israel can be a nation state of the Jewish people and a democratic state that shares values with those of us, frankly, in the majority of the American Jewish community who believe strongly in those democratic values. But there's one thing here. I think it's important to note, I'm speaking, and I think this will come in my next breakout, in the third breakout session, but I want to make it clear that when we're talking about the two-state solution, when I'm advocating for that two-state solution, I am not suggesting that American Jews should merely raise your voice and tell the Israelis, listen to us, we know better. I think our role is in a support role. We need to form, and this goes to the issue of speaking with younger people on college campuses, but it also speaks to the larger theme of this conference, the connection between American Jews and Israel. We cannot be preaching, we should be supporting. We should be creating partnerships, not only across our community, as I mentioned, but partnerships with Israel. Our organization in particular works in partnership with a group called Commanders for Israel Security, a network of over 280 top retired figures from the Mossad, Shin Bet, National Police, and the IDF. Who just this week came out with a new study published in Israel on the dangers of annexation of the West Bank, the enormous costs in terms of security costs, economic costs, legal and political costs of annexing the West Bank in a way that does not provide full citizenship to those Palestinian neighbors. I am not here to suggest that there is a two-state solution in the offing. There is not. We have a deep challenge on the Palestinian side, to say the least, divided Palestinians that are clearly not ready to negotiate the kind of compromise that would be needed, let alone implemented. It's the same on the Israeli side. But I would argue if we're going to have a meaningful conversation on these issues, we need to not talk only about what's impossible, but start talking about what is possible. What can we do today to make tomorrow better? And going back to my earlier point, how do you engage younger audiences in particular? Going back to this partnership concept, particularly the next generation need to hear from those Israeli voices that can help make the case that, yes, Israel can be a progressive cause, and you can be a progressive and support the state of Israel. We need to showcase that Israel is indeed a vibrant democracy with a vibrant media, and it has a number of and showcase the kind of diverse conversation happening inside Israel. But what does keep me up is not that we'll lose the state of Israel under the two-state dynamic. It is the one state that is the ultimate existential threat. And there's one other thing.
Brief, if you could.
Yes. I'll save it for a closing. Thank you.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to harvest one more question. I don't know. You had your chance.
I have a chance.
Right here, yes.
Okay, a couple of things. In the light of Pittsburgh, in the light of 9,000 French Jews who immigrated to Israel.
Can't hear you.
Okay, in the light of Pittsburgh and in the light of the fact that 9,000 French Jews immigrated to Israel last year and probably part of the year before, I think maybe we're not really out of Zionism too. That maybe we're not into 3 yet. We are still facing anti-Semitism that is causing immigration to Israel. And I think that that's the elephant in the room. We have to realize that this anti-Semitism is growing, and the need for Israel as a refuge for Jews is still very much there. So I also wanted to address what you say. I think we need more propaganda. The Palestinians have done a wonderful job of propagandizing our college students to the extent where they believe that Israel is a fascist, genocidal, apartheid state. And so everyone's very quiet about the good things Israel does and reaching those students in a different way. So I think we really need some money behind propaganda. I mean, literally.
Thank you.
Education.
Thank you very much. Okay, so with a few minutes to go, I'm going to ask each of you to give, a minute or so, a minute of closing. Yep, gotcha. A minute of closing. They ended the plenum late, but a minute of closing arguments or closing comments, not arguments. Gina, what are we in a courtroom?
Yeah,
Gina.
Okay, I'm going to close with one thing that I am concerned a little bit about is our country and our people have become more divided and tribalized, that I worry about what we can affect if we are not unified. The tribes are increasingly hating each other more, and where is that going to leave our community and our tribe?
Thank you. Sandy?
I think the only thing, I'll reemphasize that I may have mentioned before is, I think in trying to deal with all these kind of issues, what really comes down to that we, not just in San Francisco, but also in New York and around the country, need to continue to double down on the effort of how we figure out of building local community, of people, Jews who want to be part of community and be part of the Jewish people, because from that, I think the rest of the conversations become a lot easier. So the Israel conversation cannot be divorced from what's on us here, not on the Israelis, about what we need to do here in terms of building vibrant Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I'm glad that a couple of my comments made some of your blood boil, because that means we're having a real conversation and a real dialogue. I think the challenge is not to be afraid of those divisions, but to have a constructive discourse about the things upon which we're disagreeing. And I want to go back to something that Sandy said, that a big challenge that we're talking about in this room is not the challenge of how to get you all to come to a conference called Z3. It's how to get the people who are not here to be engaged in this conversation. And I would argue that as much as I respect the goal for more propaganda, that what is needed is not more tools for cheerleading. It's more tools for grappling with these complexities and embracing those complexities and being honest that this answer is not simple, that this issue is not simple, that the future of the state of Israel and of the Jewish people is deeply, deeply complicated. And by the way, it is fascinating, and we should invite everyone to be a part of that conversation. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. And let me just wrap with this, with my appreciation and respect to all of you. A lot of the reason why, and we know this especially about campuses, that demographic doesn't show up to this conversation is nobody wants to get in the middle of a fist fight, a gunfight with caustic comments coming left and right. I think this was a very respectful conversation in which people disagreed and shared those disagreements, and I think that's what we need to model. So I agree with you that that's really important, and I appreciate you all grappling. I want to thank our panelists for joining today, and again to the...
Thank you, all of you.
Enjoy your day.
Nice to meet you.
Really nice meeting you.